Good evening, everybody. I po everything as well. Today we listen to part 4 of the Twin Bandits. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Let's start. The late checks. Within 6 months of Kay's death, Beryl remarried. Doug considered it the Gang of Four's second loss. Around the same time, the twins began working together in construction. They were young, but they'd been trained well by their dad and could pull in more than the average subcontractor, sometimes over $500 Australian a week. The country stopped using pounds in 1966. Over time, though, Peter grew to resent being dependent on other people for his livelihood. The twins were 23 and at a construction site when Peter read a newspaper article about the Boiler Suit Gang, a group of bank robbers named after the blue outfits they wore during robberies. "We could do that," he said to his brother. At first Doug brushed him off, but Peter kept bringing it up, and Doug was soon indulging Peter's fantasies about how they'd pull off a heist. They talked about how most robberies occurred in cities, where a cop might be parked around the corner, leaving the perpetrator little time to escape. But if they went after rural targets, they could ascertain how many cops were in town and suss out where they'd be at a given time. The brothers could strike at dusk, just before closing, and use the falling darkness to conceal themselves as they fled. They could anticipate where police roadblocks would be set up and hike through the bush to avoid them. The idea, Peter told me, was basically guerrilla warfare: do the crime, disappear, and then reappear outside the search area. It was all just talk until money got tight. The twins had families to support. Their mother's second husband had 6 children, and Peter had developed a romantic relationship with his 16-year-old stepsister, Pamela. Peter married her when he was 19, the same year Doug married another woman named Pamela. Both were shotgun weddings, the twins told me, and Peter and Doug were soon fathers. In the lead-up to Easter in 1977, the twins were waiting on payment for a pair of house frames they'd built. The person who owed them said that the checks were in the mail, but they hadn't arrived. Peter, feeling stuck, decided that a robbery would free him. He was also anxious about his health. He'd suffered rheumatic fever in his teens and then developed chest pains. These were later diagnosed as symptoms of panic attacks. He feared an early cardiac event like the one that killed his father, and figured that if he wouldn't be around long enough to retire, he may as well go out and get my gold watch now. Doug was open to the idea. He, too, had been raised by a man with a criminal mindset. "My father's philosophy was that it's okay to do whatever you want to maintain the lifestyle you want," he told me. He also realized that, were they ever to be caught, the fact that they were twins might keep them out of jail. Prosecutors would be forced to prove which of them had committed the crime. As long as the brothers stayed silent, reasonable doubt would always cloud the truth. The brothers planned to use a stolen car during the crime, but Doug declined to help with that. He also refused to carry out the robbery or use a gun. "I'll do it all," Peter said. Doug agreed to serve as an assistant, helping Peter get to and from the scene. The twins decided that Peter would get 2/3 of the loot and Doug the remainder. On a rainy Holy Thursday, Peter walked into a car dealership in a suburb of Melbourne. He told the salesman that he was interested in the Ford Falcon GT, capable of going up to 140 miles per hour, and priced at about $6,500 Australian. It was the best car in the yard. The new salesman couldn't believe his good fortune. "It's a surprise for my wife," Peter told him. "So what I'd like to do is take the car to our house and show her what I'm going to buy her." Peter got behind the wheel, the salesman climbed in, and they sped off along a rain-slickened road. Peter drove to a random house nearby. The two got out and the salesman began walking up the path, eager to meet Peter's wife, who he presumed was inside. Peter drew an air pistol. "This is where we part company," Peter said. The salesman saw the gun. "What, and the car?" he managed to say. "Yeah," Peter replied. He climbed back into the driver's seat and sped away. Peter drove to a nearby cemetery where Doug was waiting in a Leland P-76 with a few jerrycans of gasoline for the stolen GT, so Peter didn't have to risk showing his face at a filling station. Rain fell in sheets over the tombstones and pounded the roofs of the cars. Doug poured the gas into the tank, bid his brother goodbye, and drove off. Then Peter waited in the cemetery for darkness to come. At dusk, Peter drove to a tab agency in nearby Mernda and entered holding a Jaeger .22 semi-automatic assault rifle he'd purchased in Melbourne. The rain had drenched his khaki carpentry overalls. He'd planned to wear a stocking over his head, but the moisture on his face had made it hard to see, so he went unconcealed. Peter ordered the manager to empty the cash drawers, then stuffed the bills into a bag and directed him to open the safe. The man refused. Instead, he gave Peter a lecture, imploring him not to ruin his life. Looking back, Peter assumed that this was prompted by his appearance. He was a 23-year-old bloke who looked like a drowned rat in his soaked work clothes. Rather than threaten to shoot, Peter backed out the door and leapt into the stolen GT. Doug was waiting behind the wheel of the Leland a few miles outside Mernda. When Peter rolled up in the GT, he threw the bag of money through the driver's side window. Doug yanked the steering wheel from its column and shoved the cash into the exposed space. Then the brothers drove off in different directions. With his adrenaline pumping, Peter raced along a forestry road in the deluge. Suddenly, the GT slid off the asphalt into a rushing creek. Peter abandoned the vehicle and made his way on foot to the rendezvous point he and Doug had agreed on. Only later would Peter realize the uncanny parallels to his father's bank robbery in nearby Eltham, the one that landed him in prison for several years. Like Kay, Peter had failed to access the establishment's safe, and like his dad, he crashed a stolen sports car. The haul from the tab agency came to $320. "You're not much of a robber," Doug said. Peter was shaken by the experience. He worried that he'd screwed up his life for a couple $100. "The paranoia sets in," he told me. "What if they know it's me? What if the car salesman gave a really good description?" When the cops failed to come knocking, Peter had an exhilarating realization. He'd gotten away with it. The missing checks from the construction job arrived 4 days after the robbery. By then it didn't matter. Peter had tasted crime and wanted more. So did Doug. The bushrangers. In the late 18th century, Great Britain established Australia as a penal colony, primarily to alleviate overcrowding in British prisons. Over time, around 160,000 prisoners were transported to the continent. Those who were uneducated were made to perform backbreaking labor under threat of corporal punishment. Some escaped into the bush seeking freedom and turned to crime to stay alive. Known as bushrangers, they adapted to life in the wilderness, forming outlaw bands that robbed travelers and settlers alike, stealing food, weapons, ammunition, bedding, and other supplies. Many bushrangers had short careers that ended in shootouts or capture, and in some cases execution. But a few gained notoriety for their bold escapades and their ability to evade capture for long periods in the wilderness. The most infamous bushranger was Ned Kelly, born around 1854 in Victoria. Kelly's father, just like the Morgan twins, was a criminal. He'd been brought from Ireland to Australia as a convicted thief. Kelly eventually committed an infamous string of robberies and bush escapes. He was captured, tried, and hanged in 1880. Unlike Kelly, who killed 3 police officers, the brothers agreed to avoid undue violence. They wanted the money, not to harm anyone. They pledged to walk away from a job if things got too hot. After the murder robbery, Doug decided that he wanted an equal role in the next heist, to prove that he was as tough as his brother. The twins set their sights on another betting agency, this one in the town of Berwick, on the southeastern fringes of Melbourne. It would be the first and only time the brothers pulled a job together. Doug still felt squeamish about carrying a gun, so he went to a local army surplus store and paid $59 for an imitation pistol. It didn't have a bore, the hole through the center of the barrel, so he'd need to avoid pointing it at anyone, or they might realize it was a fake. On the evening of May 30th, 1977, right before the robbery, Doug strolled past Berwick's police station, 100 yards from the betting agency. A cop car was parked out front. He punctured the tires with a screwdriver. Then the Morgan twins barged into the betting agency, with Peter carrying a rifle and Doug the imitation pistol. "I don't like to boast," Doug told me, recalling the event, "but the manager definitely opened the safe door when I went along." The brothers filled their bags with $916, ran outside, and mounted a pair of bicycles. Peter had painted the bikes black so they'd be less visible at night. They coasted down a hill away from the betting agency, met up with a railroad line, and pedaled along the tracks to a car parked a short distance away. For their next crime, Peter drew up what he called a double job, 2 heists committed within half an hour of each other. The first would distract police and clear the way for the second. The twins would wear identical jumpers, like when they were kids, to fool the authorities into thinking that both were carried out by a single perpetrator. Peter did his part, stealing $1,277 from a betting agency in Hastings, but Doug got cold feet and aborted his portion of the plan. 12 days later, Doug sought redemption, charging into a betting agency in Kuwi-Rup armed with the imitation pistol and a sawed-off shotgun, which he vowed he'd use only to fire warning shots. A month later, Peter planned another double job. He robbed $1,567 from a tab agency in Lilydale, only to discover afterward that Doug had balked again. 10 days later, Doug struck his assigned target, a betting agency in Healesville, a small town in the fertile Yarra Valley, where kangaroos were often spotted lazing in the shade. When he entered the TAB, a customer was placing a bet. Doug told the employee behind the counter to let the customer finish up before turning over the agency's cash. After exiting with $1,080, Doug leapt onto a bicycle and rode past the police station. He stashed the bike in some hedges and disappeared into the bush. Doug hiked about 10 miles to a rendezvous point with Peter, scratching himself on blackberry bushes and lying prone as cars passed along the highway. "It was like a game of hide-and-seek," he told me, "except your friend is going to shoot you."